Welcome to 28storms.com. This is your tropical weather update for Thursday, June 23rd. Currently, there are no highlighted areas in the latest National Hurricane Center tropical weather outlook, but that is more than likely to change within the next 2 days. The upcoming troublemaker is going to be this tropical wave currently located to the south of Hispaniola. It's going to continue moving toward the west-northwest in the general direction of Honduras, Belize, and the upper Yucatan Peninsula, and eventually the western Gulf of Mexico. Today's visible shows that things are still relatively quiet, including much of the Caribbean. We do see that there is some convection beginning to flare with that tropical wave to the south of the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and I have a strong suspicion that by the mid to latter half of the upcoming weekend, we will begin to see more of a consolidated massive convection begin to develop to the south and east of Nicaragua. And over time, that tropical wave will begin to lift this monsoonal trough and low pressure area more toward the northwest. And by 72 to 96 hours, we may begin to see more of a surface low try to form along the northern coast of Honduras, moving its way toward the Yucatan Peninsula along with Belize. The only other somewhat noteworthy area of convective activity this afternoon is located across much of the western and northwest Gulf of Mexico, where we have shower and thunderstorm activity breaking out ahead of a stalled out boundary located over northern Mexico, Texas, and Louisiana. And interestingly enough, some of the mid-level features associated with that convection to the east of Texas is part of the remnant circulation, or mid-level circulation, of former Hurricane Beatrice, the storm that formed out in the eastern Pacific and quickly dissipated after impacting much of the western half of the Mexican coastline. And what I'm showing you right now is an archived graphic showing the last few satellite images from the last few days. This starts off down here on June 21st, where we still had our hurricane just to the south of Mexico. And over time, you see that the storm dissipated, but we still have some mid-level rotation and cloud cover over mainland Mexico, and over time it has spread on into the western Gulf, where actually a few days ago the GFS was trying to develop a weak storm out of that. Obviously the model was wrong, but it did correctly model the fact that a lot of moisture was going to get entrained into the Gulf of Mexico and eventually spread into much of the central Gulf Coast states, providing some much needed rain. This is the 5-day precipitation forecast from HPC, and we can kind of make out where that stalled boundary is forecast to be over much of the central and western Gulf Coast, and right ahead of it is where we will see some of our higher rain totals with an excess of about 2 to 3 inches expected over the next 5 days. Fortunately, upper level conditions are not favorable at this time for development in the Gulf, so we're getting much needed rain without the threat of tropical development, so we can't complain too much around the Gulf today. And also that tropical wave has to contend with this upper level low diving toward the south, located just to the east of the Bahamas. So that's really going to cap any development for the next 48 to 72 hours, but the models are painting a much more favorable picture thereafter, and we'll take a closer look in just a moment. Here's the latest upper level wind analysis, and as we can see, there's a lot of strong wind shear in upwards of 50 to 60 knots where the wave is currently present. But if we notice down toward the south, we do have a suppressed area of upper level ridging, and over time that ridge will begin to expand toward the northwest. Here's a look at the colorized version of the shear. There's your 50 to 60 knots of wind shear to the south of that aforementioned upper level low. And just for good measure, here's the latest low level vorticity analysis, and obviously it's too early for any significant vorticity spin-ups along that tropical wave axis, but notice down south that's where we have the active monsoon trough. And this is going to play a vital role in the development of our system, and all of this is going to also begin expanding off toward the northwest. This is the current look at the low-level steering pattern, and as we can see, the Atlantic subtropical ridge extends from the northeast Atlantic all the way to the Florida Peninsula this afternoon, and this general pattern will persist for the next 72 to 96 hours. We also have a very deep long-wave trough over the eastern United States, and this is the low-level flow that will also direct our tropical wave. The tropical waves like to be steered by the low to mid-level, so it's going to follow this general pattern, and we will begin to continue seeing more of a west-northwest pattern toward the Yucatan Peninsula, and then after that, this pattern will have changed drastically, and that's when the forecast models will come into play to help us out. Here's just another good look at the tropical wave pumping in a lot of low-level moisture straight through the central and western Caribbean. And of course, being that this is only a tropical wave at this time, the latest ASCAT imagery is only showing very strong low-level easterlies over much of the central Caribbean in excess of about 30 miles per hour. This is the GFS forecast for early Saturday morning. At this time, the model shows a very broad area of low pressure located just to the east of Honduras and Nicaragua. And over time, the model will show some gradual organization before the system even reaches the Gulf of Mexico. We can see that this is now by early Sunday morning, the second half of the weekend already, and we have a developing tropical system to the east of Belize. And by this point, we will more than likely have an invest issued by the National Hurricane Center, and their tropical weather outlooks, I'm sure, will be monitoring the chances of tropical development, and they could be fairly high depending on whether this system takes more of a northerly path into the central Gulf or more of a westerly track where there will be much more land interaction. Overall, the upper level environment is appearing to be fairly favorable in the medium range based on the latest guidance. So land will be the key in all of this in all likelihood. And this is now by early Tuesday morning. The system is now beginning to enter the Bay of Campeche, and the system takes its good old time working its way westbound. This is already early Thursday morning, and the system is still to the east of Tampico, Mexico. It's gradually showing signs of continued intensification, more than likely a robust tropical storm based on this model solution. And if the GFS is correct, the low is just going to sit down there through the foreseeable future. Now we're going to take a look at the upper level environment. This is once again for early Sunday morning, and if we looked on the previous sea level pressure chart, it was beginning to develop a more concentrated area of low pressure down here near Belize. And as we can see, the model is beginning to develop an upper level ridge over the northwest Caribbean, as we can see by that anticyclonic flow. And this also looks favorable across much of the Gulf and western Atlantic. As we can see, there is an upper level trough over the eastern Gulf of Mexico still, and that's going to help to enhance this upper level ridge, along with the second area of upper level troughing that's now dipping to the east of the Bahamas. So overall, this looks like a fairly divergent pattern across much of where the storm is going to be located within the next 3 to 4 days, and I highly suspect that this system will be organizing into a strong tropical disturbance before it reaches the Yucatan Peninsula. It might even have a slight chance of becoming a tropical depression before it makes it that far west under this type of pattern. That all probably depends more than anything on whether or not it will come straight into Honduras or remain offshore long enough to really get going that early in the game. We're now looking at Tuesday morning, where the storm is supposed to be entering the eastern half of the Bay of Campeche, and the upper level ridge is still expected to follow the storm into the Gulf of Mexico, where it's being protected and ventilated fairly well from any type of wind shear. Now, if we look at the 500 millibar steering flow for when and if this storm does develop, we see that right now there is mid-level ridging across much of the desert southwest and leading into much of western and central Texas, whereas we still have that long wave trough along the southeast United States and eastern seaboard. But over the next 3 to 5 days, the models are showing a change or a transition with the pattern as that trough begins to lift out and that ridge over the southwestern United States begins to dominate much of the weather pattern over Texas. Now at this point, our tropical storm, or potential tropical storm, is beginning to move into the lower half of the picture here near the Yucatan Peninsula, and if it gets caught up underneath this ridge that's now developing over much of lower Oklahoma and Texas, then the more than likely track solution will be not only into the western Gulf, but a continued more westerly track into much of mainland Mexico. But the models are not ruling out Texas at the current time either. As we saw before, the GFS took the storm fairly close to the Texas coastline. So this is 75 hours out, but as I advance this, you begin to see much of the same, with the Atlantic subtropical ridge now connecting all the way westbound into the second area of ridging, which by this point is located near Memphis, Tennessee, with our storm now toward the lower half here in the Bay of Campeche working its way westbound. The latest Canadian model run has the same general track, but it is a bit more aggressive with the development of the storm. It doesn't really show as much development in the Caribbean because it keeps it more toward the south, closer to land near Honduras. But once it gets into the Gulf of Mexico and Bay of Campeche, it really begins to take off in terms of development. And this model is showing a hurricane landfall for mainland Mexico in exactly 6 days. The latest no-gaps model is also in agreement with the latest two GFS and Canadian runs. As we can see, it also begins to develop the storm in the extreme western Caribbean and despite a lot more land interaction with a more southerly track, the model continues to show steady development even as the storm is almost crossing the Yucatan Peninsula, and you can tell by day 6, even though it's a little bit slower than the Canadian, it's poised to strengthen this storm even more once it gets into the open waters of the Gulf. So even though there will be a lot of land interaction, at least with the Yucatan Peninsula, it looks as though the upper level environment is so favorable that it will overcome some of that interaction. Now, the only wrench in the model consensus is coming from the 12Z ECMWF. This model in particular keeps the system as a whole a little bit more to the west, and thus it keeps the system over land for a much longer duration, thus being the more than likely reason why this system, or this model I should say, is not developing the system as aggressively as some of the other model members. And as we see, by 72 hours, the area of low pressure, or the monsoon trough, over much of Panama and Costa Rica has now shifted off toward the northwest in the direction of Belize, and by 96 hours we begin to see a little bit more organization. By day 5, the low pressure has now made it into the Bay of Campeche, where it does try to intensify a little bit, but it just doesn't really have enough room to work with before it makes more of a secondary landfall straight into Mexico. So, as we pieced everything together, we can come up with the conclusion that the National Hurricane Center will more than likely begin highlighting an area in the Caribbean, possibly as early as within the next 24 hours, but the greater chance of development won't really begin until the mid to latter half of the weekend, where we could begin to see an organizing disturbance just to the east of the Yucatan, and there is some chance that residents in that local vicinity could be dealing with a weak tropical depression or minimal tropical storm impact. But classification or not, the main threat along Central America will be nothing more than the threat of heavy rainfall. And then the threat of further development will really begin to come in as the storm enters the central and western Gulf. And at this time, it looks more than likely that the storm will continue moving in a general westerly direction toward mainland Mexico or southern Texas, based on the fact that the models are currently showing a fairly strong mid-level ridge over much of the central Gulf Coast down the road. But that's not to say that things can't change. Oftentimes, forecasters make the mistake of trying to get too detailed beyond day 5 and 6, and we don't want to play that game too much right now, and there's really just no point for doing so. So that is your tropical update for this Thursday. Don't forget to follow us on our Facebook, where we post more random updates throughout the day, not only for the tropics, but also in terms of severe weather across the United States. And also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Therefore, you'll be one of the first people to find out whenever a new video has been uploaded. As of right now, though, you can go ahead and expect one at around this time again tomorrow afternoon. So thanks again for stopping by, and have a good one.